So we're going to get started. Like I said, during Doug's talk, he kind of, I really like that he talked about how the kings fought back when the merchant class was rising, and they tried to keep the feudal system going. Because I think Brad's talk, kind of relates to that in a modern day context. So he's going to talk a little bit about that. Without further ado, Brad Burnham.
Thank you, Evan. So I can't remember, it was a class in college where a professor taught us the lesson that where you stand depends on where you sit. And so I thought I'd start by describing a little bit about where I sit, what I do, who I am, so that you get a sense of where I'm coming from, and you can sort of, pack all my biases in there and say, okay, that's where he's coming from, all right? So I'm a partner, as Evan said, at Union Square Ventures. We're a venture capital firm based here in New York. We're best known for investing in networks, and these are, Twitter, Tumblr, Foursquare networks that, engage people. A while back, I reduced our investment thesis to a tweet. And so I want to unpack this for you for a second and give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So we invest in large networks, and that doesn't mean necessarily lots and lots of people. It could be a small number of people for whom the network is quite valuable, or it could be a large number of people for whom the network is not that valuable. So it's just large in the sense of large in value. Engaged users, large networks of engaged users. So we invest in, we'd much rather invest in something where people are actively participating in the network. There's lots of networks out there where people don't even know they're members. It's data that's being gathered surreptitiously. They don't even know they're part of that network. So we want to invest in networks where people are active participants. These networks are differentiated by user experience. That's very different than the way technology used to be differentiated. And back in the 80s and 90s, technology was always differentiated by proprietary patents and copyrights and things like that. These networks, if you look at Twitter or Tumblr, it's not, they're not defensible because they have patents or copyrights. They're defensible because they create a different user experience. And they're differentiated, because they create a different user experience. And they're defensible because of their scale, because the more people involved, the more fun it is to be involved. And that's, so that's a classic network effect. So that's what we look for. But, we kind of get typecast as we are investors in the consumer web. We just do these consumer-facing web services. That's not really true. We're also not really investing in any particular technology, mobile or web or anything like that. What we're really underneath it all doing is we're investing in the fundamental transformation of the global economy that's enabled by this connectivity that's brought about by the internet. So, just thinking about examples of, you guys are all, I'm going to just run through a bunch of examples of networks that have created value in various different things. You know about education, about health and science, travel, publishing. These are not, discrete markets. These are fundamentally disrupting major global markets. It's not like you're investing in travel technology. You're investing in the travel market, right? Entertainment, manufacturing, real estate, transportation, commerce, finance. These are all networks that are fundamentally transforming the economy. Food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, how fundamental is this transformation that is being brought, that you guys are actually living through, that you're participating in, that you're creating? How fundamental is that transformation? To talk about that, I want to put it in the context of a timeline. I'm going to go way back here. So, modern humans, 2 million years ago, we emerged as a distinct species. 10,000 years ago, we invented agriculture for the first time. We moved from being hunter-gatherers to being more sedentary and cultivating. 1440, Gutenberg invented the printing press. In 1600, we began to see the first commercial organizations. Interestingly, they were more networks than anything else. They weren't really bureaucratic hierarchies yet. We saw the Industrial Revolution in 1750. In 1855, we began to see these organizations scaling, and for the first time, we began to see the rise of the firm. The real bureaucratic hierarchy became an institution. Finally, we saw the internet, and now the internet has enabled, as everybody's become familiar with, become engaged in these networks, this network economy. So, a lot of people say that this is the most profound transition in the economy that we've seen since the printing press, right? And if you think about the transformation that was caused by the printing press, right? We had the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Enlightenment, ultimately the French Revolution, the English Revolution, the American Revolution, all arguably caused by the ability to communicate across distance and democratization of the access to information that the printing press brought about. So pretty fundamental transformation that caused a lot of dislocation in society, right? I'm going to argue that the transformation that we're going through right now is actually bigger than that. And this was pointed out to me by a guy who teaches here at NYU named Paul Romer. He argues that the right analogy, the right place to go back to is the rise of agriculture. And the reason for that is that the nature of what happened when we moved from hunter-gatherers to cultivating our own fields is we had a very fundamental change in the way we thought about property and sharing. Before, when we were hunter-gatherers, you'd kill something and you couldn't possibly eat all the meat before it spoiled, so everybody shared. And when the guy down the street killed something the next time, they shared because they couldn't eat it all, and it was a sharing economy, right? With the rise of agriculture, all of a sudden we began to create property. We began to fence in things. We began to store things. And so we moved away from a sharing economy to a property-based economy. That has been the basis for the entire economy to this point. But now what's happening is we're beginning to see the reemergence of a sharing economy, right? And the reason for that is that a lot of what happens in digital media is the creation of something called a non-rival good. If I have an apple and I eat it, you cannot also eat that apple. But if I write a blog post and you read it and you read it and you read it, everybody can read that blog post, right? So those are non-rival goods. We can share those goods without competing with each other for them. And so what we're beginning to see is the emergence of a sharing economy. And if you go back to all of the networks that I talked about, whether it's Airbnb or relay rides, these are sharing resources in ways that take better advantage of our collective assets. So we're beginning to change the way we think about property. That's a pretty fundamental transformation. So, one of the things that, if you go back to the timeline, that we sometimes forget is we assume that the bureaucratic hierarchy is the model for, economic initiative at scale. Right? I mean, we just assume that General Motors is a bureaucratic hierarchy, that governments are bureaucratic hierarchies. But we forget that those were actually invented relatively recently, right? We really, we didn't have that kind of model of economic organization until the mid-19th century. Sometimes it doesn't feel great to be inside one of these hierarchies. And I'll come back to, to talk more about this. But if you think about it, you don't feel particularly empowered inside this hierarchy. Well, the change that we're now seeing is the explosion of these hierarchies and the emergence of networks which are empowering the individuals within the hierarchies. And this is doing some really weird things. It's really changing the way economic activity gets created. So, a couple of examples. First of all, in this connected economy, in this connected world, it's much less expensive to create a new business. All of the tools are available in open source. You can reach consumers directly over the internet. You don't have to pay for the pipes. So you have access to lots and lots of consumers relatively inexpensively. So Foursquare, as an example, got to 100,000 users on $25,000, right? In an earlier era, when we didn't have this connective tissue, and you had to build a product, market the product, distribute the product, there was no way to get that kind of scale at that kind of price. So all of a sudden we have the opportunity for individuals or very small scale entities to reach global markets. So that's a fundamental change. Another thing that's fundamentally different about a networked economy. There's David Karp, who is the founder of Tumblr, once described a product launch that he did, which just as an old software entrepreneur myself, it completely blew me away. When he releases a new feature, he hides it as an Easter egg in the code. Okay, so think about that. That makes no sense. When I was a software entrepreneur, when you released a new feature, you threw a launch party, you did an analyst tour, you tried to get coverage in the New York Times, you tried to, you did anything you could to get visibility for that. He hides it, right? So how does that work? Well, he hides this new feature, and then he emails a couple of painfully hip people in Brooklyn that use Tumblr in wonderful ways, and he says, look, I'm not committed to releasing this, but if you mouse over this one little section of the site, you'll see a drop-down. There are a couple new tools. I want you to play with them, tell me what you think, but don't tell anybody because I'm not committed to releasing it. And of course, they do it, and somebody's looking at their blog, and they're going, how the hell did you do that? And in 2 weeks, there's a kid in Akron, Ohio, telling a kid down the street, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but, and the feature is ubiquitous throughout the network, right? So that couldn't have happened in a world where we didn't have this connective tissue called the internet. So these are fundamentally different. It's a fundamentally different kind of economy. The last thing I'll note about the differences is that if you think about it, these networks, think Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Foursquare, they don't really make anything, right? What does Twitter make? Right? It's you and the population of people who tweet that make things, right? You're creating all the value in Twitter. All they do is create the environment within which you create the value, right? So they don't behave like companies in the traditional sense. They don't build a product, ship a product to you, get paid by you for the product. They actually behave more like governments, right? It's their job to create the environment, to facilitate your value creation within that environment. And that's the way they treat their job. And they actually have a lot of the responsibilities that you would think of a government having. They have a responsibility to adjudicate disputes if two people want the same Twitter handle. They have a responsibility to manage the environment if there's spam or other malware in the environment. They actually even have the responsibility of defending the national interest. I mean, a couple of years ago, there was a DDoS war, denial of service war between two networks, 4chan and Tumblr, and both networks had to deploy defensive technology in order to defend the network, right? So they behave in a very different way. So this is really, kind of weird. It's not traditional. But it's also incredibly empowering, right? It's democratizing access to markets. It's democratizing access to opportunity. It's democratizing access to information. It's empowering individuals. So we should feel really, really good about all this stuff, right? We should feel, gosh, the world is opening up to us. We should really be excited about it. We should feel that the beginning is near. But we don't. We have this anxious feeling that something is going wrong in the way that the world's evolving. If you guys think about the way you think about your future, you're thinking there's a lot of angst about the world I'm going into. Am I in control? Do I know what's going on? And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is this. It's the relationship between the creation of public policy and the existing incumbents. So all of the networks that I described, just take Airbnb as an example. If you think about what Airbnb does, right? They allow people to to rent out a spare bedroom in their apartment, right? So what is it doing? It's using information to make better use of an existing asset that's lying fallow, that spare bedroom is not doing anything, and allowing people to link to each other and take advantage of that asset. Well, that's phenomenally efficient, but it's very threatening to the hotel industry, because the hotel industry is organized as a bureaucratic hierarchy. They have a lot of cost associated with the service of providing a bedroom, right, that is taken away when you do it in a network, right? So you can go from that to talk about Uber and transportation, or think about scientific publishing or educational publishing. You know, if you produce that work in a bureaucratic hierarchy, there's a lot of cost associated with producing a textbook. But if teachers collaborate to peer produce text, you know, it's much less expensive. So the incumbents are seriously threatened by the emergence of these networks. And there's no way that the incumbents can react by reducing their costs. It's just too difficult for them to reinvent themselves. The politics of that are almost impossible. So internal politics of that. So what do? They have a relationship with the incumbents on the political side, right? And so that relationship is as a result of the fact that we finance campaigns through the relationship between, you know, money and politics, and we'll talk more about that, and the fact that there's a revolving door, that people go from the public to the private sector and back to the public sector. And so there's a very tight relationship between incumbents and policymakers. And so policymakers naturally tend to find ways to support incumbents. And they come up with lots of really interesting new regulations. So this was probably among the funniest. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, Minnesota outlawed free online education, right? Because Coursera hadn't registered with the regulatory authority in Minnesota. Well, who suggested to them that they outlaw free online education? The politicians weren't thinking, oh my God, I have to outlaw free online education. Obviously, there were actually two people. It was the regulatory authority and the educational publishing interests that captured that regulatory authority. So, you know, you have to, you just keep going. The examples are almost funny. The Democrats went through a great deal of trouble to secure the rights to the music behind their big promotional video for the Democratic convention. YouTube took it down because they have automated technology that recognized that the song was actually somebody else's song, but they couldn't recognize that it had been licensed, right? So there's stuff like that going on. Airbnb. So the city of New York has increased the fines for operating a temporary hotel from $2,000 per instance to $25,000 per instance. They didn't just make that up. You know, somebody suggested that maybe they should do that. You know, I don't know if you've watched, but Uber, which is this ride service, has been fighting taxi and limousine services all over the country. And another one of my favorites is, you know, there's a new market in peer-to-peer lending. And down in South America, in Chile, they've outlawed a peer-to-peer network site because, again, these networks don't behave like companies. And so the banking regulators don't know what to do with them, right? And so they're trying to figure out how to handle it. So this is why you should feel nervous, right? This is going to keep happening. If you know, this, I don't think, I could actually, I think, I can't because it's a PDF. We've collected a bunch of these. If you copy that down, you can go to this site and you can add your own ridiculous examples. But this is a couple of pages of crazy examples of new regulations, new legislation that are simply designed to protect incumbents and to make it more difficult, more expensive for new networks. So why does this matter? Matters because innovation depends on two things. The first thing it depends on is knowledge. You have to have access to knowledge. You have to be, before you can, understand what context to create in, or what to create, or how to create, or anything. And the second is freedom. You have to be able to execute against an innovative idea. And both of those things are threatened as we see this increasingly tangled relationship between incumbent industrial hierarchies, actually, and policymakers. A way to think about this, and the thing that I wanted to do today is the problem we have is, if you go back to here for a second, all the way back, it looks like all of these different examples are happening in different markets. I mean, we're talking about financial services, we're talking about transportation, we're talking about education, we're talking about hospitality. Those are all different markets. It's all happening in different parts of the world, right? And so what's happening is a sort of death of a thousand cuts, where in all of these different jurisdictions, there are new regulations being passed that affect your ability to innovate, and they're all sort of small, they're all constrained to a single market. But what I want to try and do is I want to create a narrative that brings them all together. It makes it clear that it's really just one phenomenon, because unless we see it as one phenomenon, we won't recognize each of these instances as a threat. Because they're, how much do you really care that they raise the fine for operating a temporary hotel? It's not, I don't get in the middle of the night and say, oh my God, that's a problem. But if you see it as a part of a consistent thread. So the problem is that you have to think about the way the internet provides infrastructure for all of these various markets, right? The infrastructure, the equivalent of the plumbing, the stuff you don't see, the stuff that's under the street, is actually these very basic principles, intellectual property law, the whole idea of property, privacy and surveillance, governments, the way they set standards. This is the infrastructure. This is the equivalent of a government choosing to run water mains under the street, or to create streets, or build a national highway system. That is happening right now, and you don't think about it. You don't think about it as critical or important, but it's the basic core underlying. So the problem is that in all of these areas, there's a battle going on. It's the battle between the incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies and the emergent networks, right? And all of the choices that are being made right now in each of these areas affect the ability to innovate in all of those markets, right? So you have to see this as one single threat. So for example, today, a very good piece of news that there was a piece of legislation, an amendment that came out of committee that's sponsored by Patrick Leahy, that says, surprisingly, that the Fourth Amendment, which is the amendment that guarantees us the right against government surveillance of our letters and our homes and everything else without a warrant, right? That for the first time, Leahy is suggesting, it hasn't been passed, that applies to electronic communication. All of your letters, you don't write letters probably, you probably write emails. If you had written it as a letter, the government would require a warrant to read your letter. They can read your email without requiring a warrant, right? So Leahy is suggesting that they can. So that's not actually, that's in the area of surveillance, right? It's not, you don't think of that as, it's not in, the post office's regulatory authority. It's this underlying thing. So anyway, these are all important. Okay. So I hope, I've convinced you guys that there is something that you should be paying attention to. I don't want to leave you thinking that there's nothing that you can do. There is something that you can do. There's a bunch of different ways to approach this problem. I'm going to end up suggesting a couple, but I'm actually not going to suggest this one. This is the way the incumbents play the game. It's the relationship between the incumbent bureaucratic hierarchy on the private side and the incumbent bureaucratic hierarchy on the public side. So it's a relationship between industry and government, between lobbyists and regulatory authorities. And we could play the same game. We would be playing catch-up, right? We don't have long-standing relationships. We don't have years of having, people moving back and forth between our organizations and the government organizations that regulate us. So it would take us a long time to catch up and be as effective as the incumbents in using that technique. We could go after the core problem. this is what Larry Lessig is working on. He's got a project called Root Strikers because he's talking about going after the root problem. And the root problem is that money is more important in politics than votes, right? In this last election cycle, 361 people gave 82% of all of the PAC money, right? 361 people is 0.0000061% of the United States population. And they are more important than all of the voters because of what it takes to get somebody elected today. And those are the people that are having the dialogues. We could go after that problem with some kind of campaign finance reform. That's what Larry's working on. It's worth doing. We got to do it. But it's also a long road. We can organize. So one of the biggest successes that we've had in this whole debate between incumbent hierarchies and networks was the PIPA-SOPA debate. I don't know if anybody remembers that, but last year, exactly at this time, there was a proposed copyright legislation that would have seriously clamped down on individuals' rights to use, to repurpose information on the web. And Wikipedia went black, a bunch of other sites went, Tumblr put up stuff, and as a result, we drove an enormous amount of phone calls and letters into DC, and it scared the hell out of the politicians. They had never seen anything like it. Tumblr, in a single day, drove 90,000 calls. Three calls a second. I think it was 3 calls a second. It lit up the switchboards. They had never seen anything like it. So one of the tools that we have is we have the ability to use the networks to save the networks, right? And so when you see these things, pop up in the network, when the network says, hey, guys, you should pay attention to this piece of legislation, go ahead and click through, read it, and if you feel moved, make the call. They've never seen it before, so it has a big effect. So that's one that I'd really encourage you to do. The other thing we can do is try and just make this whole loop irrelevant. And so this is an idea of what if there was some place on the planet, somewhere, that had a different regime, right? That had a different set of regulations, a different legislative environment, different policy environment. If you think about it, there is, this is called jurisdictional competition. It's why we have gambling on Indian reservations. It's why we have tax havens in the Bahamas. It's why we have charter schools. It's actually why we have states. The founding fathers originally believed that it was a good idea to have lots of different jurisdictions to experiment, and rather than a single federal jurisdiction. So it's a very old idea to imagine that there's a place. Well, if you had that place, and on the internet, you have a particularly interesting set of opportunities and problems, right? So what does jurisdiction mean on the internet? What does it mean if you have a user in New York and a server in the Bahamas and a company incorporated in Delaware? And you're going to the Bahamas to get the bits. You're consuming those bits in New York, and the money is flowing to a corporation that's, let's say, more fun would be incorporated in Ireland because of the international tax laws that are attractive in Ireland. And so who gets to decide what you can and can't do in that context, right? So what's nice about this is that nobody knows the answer to this question. So if we can create a jurisdiction anywhere on the planet that is actually open to innovation, and I would think about it as, thinking about it in these categories. If it had, if it was sort of, sensible, reciprocal, and fair. Think about copyright for a second. If the current, what is it called? It's called statutory damages for infringing on a single work can be up to $150,000. So if you download a song, in theory, you can be liable to up to $150,000 to the record company whose value you've absconded with somehow. If the record company inadvertently takes down a song that you've already licensed or a song that you own, they're not liable to you at all. So if they take down the music behind the Democratic Convention on YouTube, they're not liable to anybody. So the idea of just beginning to put this stuff into balance would be a good idea. If this policy framework were centered around users and not necessarily around corporations, and not necessarily around incumbent corporations that had a specific interest in a specific business model, then it would be more open to innovation. There's lots of interesting things you can do, given the web, to manage these services in creative ways that weren't available in the past. So anyway, and again, it's all of these, on the issue side, this is the plumbing, this is the core infrastructure of a society that's empowered and enabled by these networks. So the theory is that if you create the right environment, the first thing that it'll do is attract data. If you go back to what does jurisdiction mean, if the data is sitting somewhere offshore, it's kind of out of reach. And so if the government says you can't use that service, you can't use that data, where that's going to end up is that's going to end up in a sort of an arms race between, okay, well, what are you going to do? You're going to shut down my IP address? You're going to shut down the Bahamas IP address? All of the Bahamas IP addresses? And then they're going to change the service will change their IP addresses, and then you have to shut down the entire Bahamas. And then they're going to start shutting down your IP address because you're going to the Bahamas. And then you're going to get a proxy server, and then they're going to have to shut down all the proxy servers. And then you're going to get an onion router, and then they're going to have to shut down all the onion routers. And eventually what they're doing is basically saying, you can't have access to knowledge, right? And that's untenable politically. They can't go all the way there, right? So the first thing that's going to happen is data is going to move. The next thing that's happening is users are going to move to go get that data. Finally, you're going to start to see investment, and ultimately, the goal here is not to make some jurisdiction the innovation capital of the world. The goal here is to create a global conversation about what it really means to empower users to create a fair and balanced set of regulations. And once that conversation starts, I think politicians will actually be relieved. They'll be able to turn to their funders and say, guys, I'd really like to pass this ridiculous piece of legislation for you, but if I do, I'm going to watch all of this economic activity shifting offshore, and that doesn't make any sense for my constituents. I'll lose jobs, I'll lose dollars, I'll lose tax revenue. I can't do that, right? And so you're giving them the tool to say no to their funders. So, I sort of talk about this regulation offshore, or the idea of jurisdictional competition, and a lot of people look at that and they think, I'm really kind of coming off with a very strong libertarian. I want cyber utopia. I want a cyber libertarian view. I want freedom on the internet. I don't want any regulation at all, and that's really not true. And it's been hard for me to try and figure out how to define what it is I do want and what it is I believe in, because I get these conversations. I had a conversation with a guy named Julian Sanchez, who's at the Cato Institute in Washington, who's a big libertarian think tank. And I told him that I'm a very strong believer in network neutrality. Now, what network neutrality means is that the underlying physical network, usually provided by the cable company or the phone company, can't actually decide what goes over those pipes. They have to be neutral about what goes over those pipes. And the libertarians look at that and they say, well, that's regulation, right? Why would we, won't that constrain the market economy? Won't that contort the market economy in some way? And I'm sitting and thinking, well, the natural monopoly characteristic of a single wire into the home, like a single road coming to your driveway, you don't want to have 10 roads coming to your driveway. You don't want to have 10 wires coming to your house. There's no logic in that. Because of that natural monopoly characteristic, you already have a broken market. right? So you ought to, intervening in that market in a way that creates competition at the level above that physical layer is a good idea in my mind. So I'm not saying that regulation is bad, but now I'm in a really tough position of trying to define what I mean by regulation, what's good and what's bad. And so a couple of ideas, and this is sort of fresh thinking. I don't know the answer to this, but I'm trying to get better at being able to argue with the libertarians. And so I think there are ways to regulate that are lighter touch. A lot of the regulation that you see today coming out of the current policy and coming out of the current incumbent regulatory authorities is prescriptive. It says, thou shalt not do this, right? And the problem with that is that really does distort markets. But you can have, because and the reason they have to do that is that in a traditional economy, you can't see the results of the user's behavior or the company's behavior in enough of a loop to be able to adapt to it quickly. And so you just say, you can't do that, right? Well, on the internet, there's so much data available and there's such a fast feedback loop that you can begin to create solutions that you couldn't have created before. So you can think about regulation differently. And so a lot of, what we think about is creating net native regulatory regimes, that like in the same way that the services that we're talking about, whether it's a spare bedroom or a ride in a car, can be produced by a peer network, the regulation can also be managed and produced by a peer network. So, that's a hard thing for Health and Human Services to think about, but if, as an example, or the FDA to think about, if you could accelerate the feedback loop as new drugs are in the market so that you don't have a 10-year period before you figure out that something's actually toxic, if you can just increase the information flow, then you can reduce the amount of time it takes to approve something, right? And so there's lots of interesting things you can do there. Anyway, the two things at the end of the day that I think separate me from the libertarians is I believe that there are natural monopolies that create market power that that require some intervention, some very light touch intervention to facilitate the actual normal behavior of that market or the productive behavior of that market. There are also externalities. So an externality is a factory produces pollution, right? And we still have byproducts of activities that cause harm that don't get internalized in the cost of the activity, right? And so another role for regulation is just to make sure that you're internalizing those externalities. So the person producing the service is incorporating all the costs of their service in their price. And you can do that, again, with these faster feedback loops. So to come back to what we're really seeing, there's two kinds of regulation. There's the traditional regulation tends to be before the fact, and it's prescriptive, and it's thou shalt not, and it's governed by a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies have these inherent limitations. If you think about, go back to that slide in your head at least of the bureaucratic hierarchy, information goes up and decisions come down, right? And information gets corrupted on the way up and decisions get corrupted on the way down. So they're really imperfect mechanisms for making social choices. And so, having bureaucracies determine how markets are going to behave is not necessarily a great idea. These mechanisms have lots of friction. They're also permission-based. You can or you cannot do something. What if we thought about it differently? If we started thinking about regulation a little bit after the fact, right? So in a network, you can see the feedback loop, right? You can see what's happening very quickly, and it's much more transparent. So you can regulate based on that transparency. And so you don't have to say, thou shalt not. You say, go ahead, but, we're going to fix it really quickly if it screws up, right? And, you can make people accountable in those networks. And ultimately, that allows for a great deal more innovation. It's you know, the divider between these two models is really about trust. And most bureaucrats are not yet ready to trust the industry that they're regulating. And there's good reason for that. There's lots of good examples of that. But if you think about what's happening in all of these peer networks, that's the quality that exists there that did not exist in the bureaucratic hierarchy. I trust the person I'm renting a room from. I trust the person I'm taking a ride with, right? So it's, you know, if you add that to the equation, you open up a new whole mechanism. So one of the most interesting things about this is that it's not clear that this fits in any political party, right? What I just described to you is a competition between incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies and networks, right? Well, if you think about the traditional Democratic Party, you know, they actually depend on incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies for votes. They're called unions, right? And the unions actually depend on incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies on the private sector, in the private sector, the industries that the unions are part of, right? And so if you go after, you know, an incumbent industry, the first people that they're going to line up to try and recruit the Democrats to defend that industry are the unions, right? If you think about it from the Republican perspective, the incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies are represented by the Chamber of Commerce, right? They represent the economic interests in those hierarchies and not the labor interests in those hierarchies. And so neither of the Republican or the Democrat or are currently positioned well to say, I'm going to go and embrace networks. It's also true that if you look down that list of things that are the infrastructure of the internet economy, things like the regulatory framework, the policy framework for the internet economy, you've got these weird coalitions on both sides. So think about government surveillance, right? So you've got Dianne Feinstein in California, who's a left-wing Democrat who happens to be on the I don't remember what committee, but she's just so in the pocket of law enforcement that she can't even think about the possibility of, you know, cutting back the authority of law enforcement in order to protect the privacy of individuals. So and then you've got, you know, people like David Goodlatte on the right, who is also, all about law enforcement, and they're aligned to actually allow a higher level of surveillance of us as individuals then. And so you've got these weird relationships. In the original People Sopa fight, you had wildly, it was Patrick Leahy who proposed the Senate version, the PIPA version of that copyright restriction. He's now the guy who's proposing to extend our Fourth Amendment rights into cyberspace. So, he does this crazy thing that's completely against the interests of networks, then he does this thing that is in the interests of networks. So it's very confusing to politicians. Somebody is going to realize this. Somebody's going to realize that there is a new center. There's a new way of thinking about politics, and it's actually not as much sort of left and right. It's more up and down. It's more about empowering the edge of the network, empowering the users as opposed to the incumbent hierarchies. And it turns out that actually the incumbents on the political side tend to have a very close relationship with the incumbent hierarchy, so it's hard for them to think about empowering the networks, empowering the users. As a result, it's a jump ball. This is a guy who's is a right-wing, not particularly right-wing, but he's definitely a Republican strategist. And he's saying this is the Republicans' opportunity to sort of, seize the future. If you think about the last big political transition, it was when it was the Reagan Democrats, it was the conservative Democratic South that went over to the Republican Party. And they then dominated, national politics through the entire Reagan era, and through pretty much, until the Clinton era. And so if the Republicans figure out that they can be the party of freedom, and if you think about it, free enterprise sounds fairly Republican. Individual autonomy sounds fairly Republican. Individual rights, leave me alone, don't tread on me. All of those are values that are kind of central to, the right. And so the other possibility is that the progressives, this is Stephen Johnson's book, it's a great book if you haven't seen it. He's basically talking about what he describes as peer progressives, which is a party that doesn't exist, but it's a party that recognizes the power of these peer networks and embraces that power and figures out how to, create political momentum as a result of that power. So anyway, that's it. That's all I got. I mean, just to go back, what I wanted to try and do is I wanted to try and, sort of point at a bunch of different examples of things that are happening, whether it's Minnesota outlawing education or New York outlawing temporary hotels or Washington, D.C. outlawing ride sharing, and say, okay, those all sound like they're different things, but it's one common thread. And the common thread is incumbent bureaucratic hierarchies competing with hyper-efficient peer networks. Those peer networks are really important. And it's not just because, I invest in them or I like them or I think they're cool. I believe that the limitations of bureaucratic hierarchies are actually such that we will not be able to dig ourselves out of the hole that we've dug. So the way we run the country, the fiscal cliff that we're about to go over, the public and private bureaucratic hierarchies are going to go over that cliff in lockstep because they can't make the decisions they have to make. The way that we're going to get out of that mess is that your generation that understands the power of these networks is going to figure out a way to actually avoid the question of whether we need to raise more taxes or lower government spending by basically making government less relevant by finding more services in these peer networks. And that's the way that we're going to get out of the mess. So we need to do that. And if we can't do that, then the reason we won't be able to do that is because of this relationship between the public bureaucratic hierarchies and the private bureaucratic hierarchies. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted just to make that, make all those different activities, clearly part of a single narrative, and hope to alert you guys to the possibility that you're in a position to make a difference, and I hope you do. That's it. And I'd love to take questions.
After listening to your talk, I'm thinking about Bitcoin.
Yep.
So what's your opinion about that?
Bitcoin, if you push this all the way to the extreme, I'm talking about the competition between bureaucratic hierarchies and networks, but there is a question about the role of the state, right? And I think that you guys in your generation are going to see some really interesting conversations about the role of the state. One of the key roles of the state is that they take a piece of paper and they imbue value in that piece of paper, and they back that piece of paper. Bitcoin doesn't require that backing, right? And so it's fairly threatening to states because one of the key sources of power that they have is the ability to manipulate the value of that currency to affect the economy and to get reelected. And so I think it's interesting. I will tell you that we're investors in one payment processing company called Dwolla out in the Midwest, and all of the fraud that we deal with in Dwolla is happening in Bitcoin. So there's problems that need to be solved. It's possible that there are elegant regulatory solutions that might be something like eBay ratings or some peer-produced mechanism that identifies and manages fraud in a more decentralized way that would make Bitcoin more acceptable and more palatable broadly. But I think, pay attention. Keep an eye on it. Yeah.
So in Future Perfect, Jocelyn talks about how kind of the top-down models of hierarchy have kind of the power pulled to the center, and he kind of argues that the network models have like the power distributed throughout the nodes. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we need to get rid of the top-down hierarchies altogether?
Let's have that conversation in 20 years. I bet you won't even, you will look back in 20 years and we'll go, we didn't get rid of them. In the same way we didn't get rid of radio, I mean, it still plays a role in our lives. But I think that they will be a lot less important. I think that if you look at, your generation and you look at the number of people that are going to work for IBM versus creating their own, livings, it's a smaller number of people. And I think that, over, the period of a generation, I think that transformation is going to take place. It's actually one of the things I believe that, what we want to do is we want to work through this transition, and ideally we want to work through it in a single generation. If you think about sort of the 50s in this country, there were, from the 50s through the 70s, there were a bunch of really great jobs in the automobile industry in Detroit doing 31 spot welds every 20 minutes on an assembly line. And those people were paid, $50 and $40 an hour in current dollars. And they had a boat and a snowmobile and a nice house, and their kids went to school and went to college. And the only real crime was if their kids who were well educated went back to doing 31 spot welds every 20 minutes, right? And so, and they did some because they were being paid a lot to do that. I think that there's a generation who works inside of these bureaucratic hierarchies who are going to have a very difficult time accepting responsibility for their own economic future and making their own choices. And, I think we have to figure out how to manage that dislocation as we go through this transition. It's a reason I believe that government can play a positive role to manage that dislocation. But I'd feel really badly if it took 2 generations. I'd like to get through that in 1 generation.
So you mentioned your libertarian friends dislike net neutrality via regulation, but in their defense, isn't the same regulation already responsible for the incredibly non-neutral, monopolistic internet that we have now?
Yeah, they do say that if you want us to, they've said to me that we're probably not going to come out and celebrate net neutrality, but if you want to get us to be silent, go after something that's already been corrupted by the government regulation, and that's they clearly are handing me that argument. They're saying, that the telecommunications industry and the wireless industry is monopolies created by regulation, and and therefore inherently screwed up. So they do offer that.
So, but then, is there any difference between the regulation that the government could provide and then the de facto regulation that we're getting through the corporations? Like, what's the difference there?
Are you okay? So is this a question about, is it possible to regulate in an enlightened way?
What's the difference between the regulation that we're getting via our government, of which we're all constituents, we're in that network somehow, versus the corporations, what they're doing, and we're consumers, we're in that network somehow. Like, how are those 2 networks different? So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. One of the reasons that it's hard to argue against any regulation in a political context provided by the government is that you don't always have the choice of voting with your feet, and if the regulation is in a private corporate context, if you're only being provided certain things, in theory you can vote with your feet and you can go find another supplier, right? And so if that's the question, then that's a huge difference. But what's really interesting and what's mind-blowing to me about this problem is that notion of voting with your feet on the internet is different. And it might be possible to vote with your feet by going to a jurisdiction, at least digitally and virtually, where there's a regulatory framework that's more conducive to your view of the world. So I think it plays out in this context in a very interesting way. Yes?
So you brought up the kind of Wikipedia, Google, Tumblr actions in the scope of PIPA debate as an example of kind of good uses of peer network. But the actual number of people who made the decisions to commit these websites to advertising was considerably less than 381. And it could be expressed as basically bypassing the middleman of, instead of giving money, going directly to getting advertising that money was used for. So do you really feel that this is conceptually different than just kind of people who are in positions of influence using their power to stump for an issue that you feel is valuable?
I do, and so I'm going to try and restate what you just said so that I make sure I understand it correctly. You're saying that it was 361 people, I think, on the super PACs, but and if you take all of the websites that went dark, basically it was David Karp at Tumblr, and it was Larry Page at Google, and it was Jimmy Wales at Wikipedia, and so that's three people who had the biggest influence on that, and so that's less than 361 people, right? Okay, so two things. One, actually, there were a huge number of blogs and single user sites that went black, right? You didn't notice them because you don't go to them, and but they did have collectively a pretty big impact. Second is that the Wikipedia decision was agonizing and completely open. I don't know, you can go back, it's still archived. You can look at the entire debate amongst all the people who contributed to Wikipedia and it was agonizing. They said we're above politics. There's a whole faction that said we can never do this because that's a violation of our trust to users. We can't do that. And it took a long time. It took months for them to arrive at that conclusion. So that whole debate took place in the open. It involved a lot of people who contributed and participated in Wikipedia. Third, in something like Tumblr, David Karp decided to, put up the, the little blurb on the homepage and alert people to the problem and encourage them to call, but he didn't make them call. So there's a whole bunch of people who recognized the problem, agreed with him, and individually acted, right? But I think what you're getting at is the question of, if I have a pulpit, and if I can, reach lots of users, is there a risk of another kind of control that is not particularly better than the control that is currently exercised through campaign donations? Maybe. I'll leave you with that problem to solve because I'll be dead by then.
Can I do one?
Sure.
You used the analogy of roads to. So as we know, what happened with roads is they became, a public utility and and they are separated from the trucking companies. Do you see a similar kind of structural separation coming?
Well, that's the best argument for network neutrality, is that the reason, railroads also have a common carrier responsibility, and roads have a common carrier responsibility. And the reason for that is that if the roads were owned by the trucking companies, then the entire economy, it becomes basically dictated by the distribution, right? And if the internet economy is, if I can set rates differently for you than for you, and I can offer services differently to people on that wired network, then I could have the same impact on the economy. And so we were smart enough, and actually the whole idea of common carriage goes back to the 16th century in Britain with freight carriage, because they didn't want distribution to control the economy. So for the same reason...
But is the actual result structural separation? I noticed that Susan, Tim Wu, they all talk about structural separation having started as net neutrality as a departure point.
Okay, so structural separation is actually a different way of solving the problem. Network neutrality says that the people who own the wires have to remain neutral. They can continue to own the roads, but they have to let anybody on the road. Structural separation says that that the underlying utility has to offer their copper or their fiber to lots of different companies, and then those companies compete. That's the way the market works in Europe, and it actually works pretty effectively. In France today, the Free is the largest provider of internet services, and it does not have any facilities. It rides on top of the France telecom infrastructure.
Do you think that'll ever happen here?
I think it's, I mean, it depends on how effective we are in beginning to create an understanding of how important these freedoms are to the freedom to innovate. But it's a really difficult political fight right now. Thank you.